On August 1st, 1944, a thin ribbon of silver aircraft appeared over the southern horizon of Kyushu. At first, Japanese coastal observers assumed it was a reconnaissance flight, another probing gesture that would turn back before committing to anything costly. Minutes later, the sky began to throb. Not dive bombers, not carrier planes, heavy bombers, high, steady, unhurried. It was the sound the Imperial Japanese Air Army Service had quietly convinced itself would never become routine. Before the war, Japanese strategic planners had studied American air power closely and then dismissed it. Their assumption was not that the United States lacked bombers, but that it lacked endurance. Distance, they believed, was Japan's greatest ally. The Pacific was too wide, the logistics too complex, the bomber losses too punishing. Sustained strategic bombing, week after week, month after month, was judged impractical, even impossible. American bombers might reach Japan once or twice, but never enough to break an industrial nation hardened for war. That belief shaped everything. When the Doolittle raid struck Tokyo on April 18, 1942, it shocked the public but not the high command. 16 B-25 Mitchells, launched from the USS Hornet, dropped small bomb loads and vanished. In internal memoranda, the raid was described as a morale attack, militarily insignificant. The planners in Tokyo took comfort in the fact that the aircraft had no bases nearby. It was a stunt, not a system. The Pacific, they told themselves, had reasserted its dominance, but systems were already being built. On June 15, 1944, B-29 Super Fortresses of the U.S. Army Air Force's XX Bomber Command lifted off from Chengdu, China, bound for the Yawata Steelworks on Kyushu. Operation Matterhorn was inefficient, dangerous, and staggeringly expensive. Every gallon of fuel flown over the Himalayas cost multiple gallons burned just to deliver it. Japanese intelligence saw this and relaxed. If this was America's solution, it would burn itself out. Then came the Marianas. By July 1944, Saipan had fallen. Tinian followed on August 1st. Guam was secured by August 10th. To the Japanese General Staff, these were naval disasters, tragic but still within a familiar framework of island warfare. What they failed to grasp, even then, was what those islands meant in concrete and steel. Engineers of the U.S. Navy Seabees began pouring runways longer than anything Japan possessed. Hard-packed coral became airfields capable of launching hundreds of heavy bombers every day without the logistical contortions of China. On November 24, 1944, the illusion finally cracked. That morning, 111 B-29s from the 73rd Bomb Wing took off from Saipan and Tinian and flew directly to Tokyo. Their target was the Musashino Aircraft Engine Plant, one of the heartbeats of Japanese aviation production. The weather was clear. The bombers flew at over 30,000 feet, higher than most Japanese interceptors could reliably reach. Anti-aircraft shells bloomed far below, black puffs in empty air. Inside the Imperial Army headquarters, reports arrived in fragments. Bombers had not turned back. Losses were minimal. Damage assessments were incomplete, but the fact that the bombers had come and returned was undeniable. This was not a raid. It was the opening note of a campaign. Japanese air defenses were built for a different war. Fighters like the Nakajima K-43 and Mitsubishi A-6M0 were agile, lethal at low altitude, and nearly helpless against high-flying, heavily armed bombers. Radar coverage was thin and often unreliable. Fuel shortages limited pilot training hours to a fraction of American standards. By late 1944, some interceptor pilots had less than 100 hours total flight time. They climbed toward the B-29s with frozen oxygen lines, guns that jammed in the cold, and the knowledge that even a successful attack might only cripple one bomber out of dozens. Still, The high command clung to hope. They believed weather would save them. The jet stream over Japan, unknown to American planners at first, scattered bomb patterns and reduced accuracy. Early high-altitude raids did less damage than expected. Factories adapted. Production dispersed into smaller workshops. Officials convinced themselves the Americans would grow frustrated, redirect their bombers to Europe, or accept diminishing returns. Then Curtis LeMay changed the rules. On the night of March 9, 1945, 334 B-29s took off from the Marianas. They flew low, around 5,000 to 9,000 feet, stripped of most defensive guns to carry more incendiaries. Their target was not a factory, but a city, Tokyo. Specifically, the densely packed working-class districts east of the Imperial Palace. At 12:08 a.m. on March 10, the first Pathfinder flares ignited over the Sumida River. Within minutes, M69 napalm-filled bomblets began to fall. Wooden houses caught instantly. Wind rushed into the fire, feeding it, accelerating it. By 1:30 a.m., a firestorm had formed. Temperatures reached levels that melted glass and boiled canals. Oxygen was sucked from the streets. People suffocated standing upright. Japanese civil defense units were overwhelmed in minutes. Fire breaks failed. Water pressure collapsed. By dawn, over 100,000 people were dead. 16 square miles of Tokyo reduced to ash. The bodies were so numerous, they were stacked along riverbanks for identification. Many were never identified at all. Inside the Japanese leadership, there was no longer any talk of endurance, only silence. And the bombing did not stop. Nagoya burned on March 11th, Osaka on March 13th, Kobe on March 16th. Each raid refined the method. Each raid exposed the same truth. Japan's cities were flammable, its defenses porous, its industrial base inseparable from civilian life. By April 1945, B-29s were flying almost daily missions. Some crews joked grimly about seeing their own previous bomb patterns still smoldering when they returned. Japanese soldiers, too, were watching. Factory conscripts drafted into air defense units wrote in diaries about the feeling of helplessness, of hearing bombers before seeing them, of firing until barrels glowed, of watching bombs fall in slow, deliberate arcs. One conscript in Osaka noted on June 7, 1945, that the bombers came like a factory themselves, unchanging, mechanical, endless. That was the final, crushing miscalculation. The Japanese High Command had expected courage to compensate for material inferiority, weather to compensate for numbers, and distance to compensate for industry. What they encountered instead was an enemy capable of sustaining pressure without pause, replacing aircraft faster than Japan could train pilots, adapting tactics faster than Japan could redesign defenses, and accepting losses as a temporary inconvenience rather than a strategic barrier. By the summer of 1945, Japan's cities were being destroyed faster than they could be cataloged. The bombing had become not an episode, but a condition of daily life. Sirens were no longer a warning, they were a routine. Strategic bombing, sustained and relentless, was never supposed to happen to Japan. It was a scenario dismissed in staff rooms and war colleges, waved away with confident gestures toward maps of the Pacific. Yet by August 1945, those maps were meaningless. The sky itself had become hostile, and the realization came too late to stop it.